The day my daughter tried to steal my home. A true story of betrayal and justice. I never thought I'd be standing in my own living room, watching strangers carry out my furniture while my own daughter supervised with a clipboard and a cold smile. But that's exactly where I found myself on the morning of November 3, 2024, less than 24 hours after I'd signed those trust documents that were supposed to secure my family's future. My name is Kathy Richardson. I'm 67 years old. And what I'm about to tell you is the true story of how my daughter tried to steal everything from me, and how I made sure she regretted every single second of it. But before we get into this shocking tale, if you enjoy stories about justice being served and families getting what they truly deserve, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Drop your city and country in the comments below. Knowing I'm not alone in this makes all the difference. Now let me take you back to where it all began. 2 days before that horrible morning, I was sitting in my attorney's office, feeling proud and responsible. My husband George had passed away 3 years earlier, leaving me with a comfortable inheritance of $3.2 million, our beautiful Victorian home in Portland, Oregon, and a lake house in Montana that had been in his family for generations. I'd spent those 3 years grieving, healing, and finally deciding it was time to protect these assets for my children and grandchildren. My attorney, Robert Chun, had drawn up the paperwork for an irrevocable trust. The plan was simple, or so I thought. The assets would be protected from estate taxes, I'd have lifetime use of everything, and upon my death, my daughter Melissa and my son David would inherit everything equally. It seemed like the responsible thing to do as I approached my later years. I remember the weight of the pen in my hand as I signed those documents on my 65th birthday, November 2nd. Robert had explained everything carefully, but I'll admit, some of the legal jargon went over my head. I trusted him. I trusted the process. Most of all, I trusted my family. That night, I called Melissa to let her know the trust was finalized. I thought she'd be pleased that I was being so thoughtful about the family's future. Her voice sounded strange on the phone, excited, but in a way that made my stomach feel odd. She said she and James would come by the next morning to discuss some things. I thought maybe they wanted to talk about Thanksgiving plans or her youngest son's college applications. I should have known something was wrong. Melissa had changed over the past 5 years, ever since she married James Cartwright. He was a failed real estate developer with expensive tastes and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. But she was my daughter, and I wanted to believe in her happiness. That morning, I was in my garden cutting the last of the autumn roses when I heard the trucks. Not one truck, 3 large moving vans rumbling down my quiet tree-lined street. My hands started shaking, and the thorns bit into my fingers as I dropped the pruning shears. Melissa stepped out of a black SUV, wearing a business suit I'd never seen before, with James right behind her, grinning like he'd won the lottery. Behind them, a crew of movers stood waiting for instructions. "Mom," Melissa said, walking up my front path like she owned it, which I would soon learn she believed she did. "We need you to pack some personal items. The movers are here to take everything else." I actually laughed. It was such an absurd statement that my brain couldn't process it as real. "What are you talking about? Is this some kind of joke?" James stepped forward, and that's when I saw the folder in his hand. "Kathy," he said, using my first name like we were colleagues instead of family, "when you signed those trust documents yesterday, you transferred ownership of all assets including this house to the trust. As co-trustees, Melissa and I have legal authority to manage those assets as we see fit. We've decided to sell this property. We've already accepted an offer. Closing is in 30 days. The world tilted. I actually had to grab the porch railing to keep from falling. "What?" "No," Robert said, "I'd have lifetime use of the assets." "Yes," Melissa interrupted, her voice as cold as January rain. "But the trust agreement allows the trustees to liquidate and reinvest assets for the benefit of the trust. This house is worth $1.8 million, Mom. It's not efficient to have that much money tied up in a single property that only you use. We're selling this and the Montana house. The proceeds will be invested, and you'll receive a monthly allowance." "An allowance?" I could barely whisper the word. "This is my home. Your father and I bought this house 42 years ago. You grew up here. Your children took their first steps in this living room." James smirked. "Sentimental value doesn't generate returns, Kathy. Melissa and I have a duty to maximize the trust's value. We found you a nice one-bedroom apartment in a senior living community. Very affordable, only $1,800 a month, which will come out of your allowance." I looked at my daughter, searching for any trace of the little girl I'd raised, the woman I'd supported through college, through her first marriage, through every crisis she'd ever faced. "Melissa, you can't do this. Please." For just a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes. But then James put his hand on her shoulder, and her face hardened again. "It's already done, Mom. The law is on our side. You have until the end of the week to remove your personal belongings. Everything else has been cataloged and will be sold with the house or at auction." That's when the movers started walking past me, into my home, and I realized this nightmare was really happening. I want to pause here and ask again. If you're finding this story gripping, please like and subscribe. Your support means the world to me, and it helps others find these important stories about family, betrayal, and standing up for yourself. Now back to that terrible day. I called my son David immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. He lived in Seattle with his wife and 2 kids, working as a marine biologist. When I told him what was happening, there was dead silence on the line. "Let me call you back, Mom," he finally said, his voice tight with anger. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. It was David, and I could hear the fury in his voice. "I just spoke with Melissa. She said this was a business decision, and that I'd understand when I received my distribution from the improved investment returns." "Mom, I don't want any of this. Did you know they could do this when you signed?" "No," I sobbed. Robert explained I'd have lifetime use of everything. I thought lifetime use meant I could live here until I died. "It should mean that," David said. "Something's wrong here. Don't sign anything else. I'm calling a lawyer friend right now." But as the day wore on and I frantically called Robert Chen's office, I learned the horrible truth. Robert was Melissa's attorney, not mine. He'd represented the trust, yes, but in setting it up, he'd been working under Melissa's instructions. She'd been planning this for months, ever since I'd first mentioned wanting to protect the inheritance. The trust documents, which I'd skimmed but not fully understood, gave the trustees, Melissa and James, broad powers to manage assets in the best interest of the trust beneficiaries. There was a clause about my lifetime use, but it was buried under provisions that essentially let them override it for investment purposes. I'd been manipulated, betrayed, and worst of all, it was all perfectly legal. That first night I sat in my bedroom, the room I'd shared with George, where we dreamed our dreams and built our life, and I cried until I had no tears left. Through the walls I could hear the movers downstairs, wrapping up my life in bubble wrap and packing tape. But somewhere around midnight, sitting there in the darkness, something inside me shifted. I stopped crying. I started thinking. George used to say that I was tougher than I looked. When he got sick, I'd managed all his care, learned about every medication, fought with insurance companies, and made sure he had dignity and comfort right until the end. I'd raised 2 children, worked as a nurse for 35 years, and survived the loss of my own parents and my only sister. I wasn't some helpless old woman who would just roll over and accept this. If Melissa and James wanted a war, I'd give them one. The next morning, I made a series of phone calls. First, to David's lawyer friend, Martin Fitzgerald, who specialized in trust and estate litigation. Second, to my oldest friend, Patricia, who worked for the Portland Tribune. Third, to every single social contact Melissa and James had cultivated in their desperate climb up Portland's social ladder. Martin met me that afternoon. After reviewing the trust documents, his face was grim. "I'm not going to lie to you, Kathy. They structured this cleverly. Challenging it will be expensive and time-consuming, and there's no guarantee we'll win." "How expensive?" "Potentially $200,000 or more in legal fees. And it could take 2 years. I thought about the $47,000 I had in my personal checking account. Money that hadn't been transferred to the trust because it was in an account that only had my name on it. What are my chances? Martin leaned back in his chair. If we can prove undue influence, fraud, or that you didn't understand what you were signing due to lack of proper independent legal counsel, maybe 30%. But Kathy, there's another angle we should consider. We could make this so publicly ugly and legally complicated that they'd rather settle than continue fighting. Tell me more, I said, leaning forward. And that's when Martin outlined a strategy that made me smile for the first time in 2 days. Over the next week, while I pretended to pack my belongings, I put my plan into motion. First, Martin filed an emergency petition in probate court, alleging elder abuse, fraud, and constructive trust. The legal filings made it clear that I was fighting back, and they froze any major asset sales until a hearing could be held. Second, Patricia ran a story in the Tribune. Local woman claims daughter exploited estate planning to seize family home. It was factual, detailed, and devastating. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times on social media. Third, and this was the part I'm least proud of but most satisfied by, I attended every social event, every charity gala, every book club meeting that Melissa and James cared about, and I told my story. Not with tears or drama, but with quiet, dignified sadness that was somehow more powerful than any rage could have been. Portland's high society, which Melissa and James had been desperately trying to infiltrate, turned on them overnight. Invitations dried up. James's business contacts stopped returning calls. The private school where they'd been trying to enroll Melissa's youngest son suddenly had no available spots. But I wasn't done. Through some careful investigation, Martin discovered that James had significant undisclosed debts, over $800,000 in failed real estate investments and personal loans. This was crucial because as co-trustees, James and Melissa had a fiduciary duty to disclose any conflicts of interest. James's desperate financial situation made his motives for liquidating my assets crystal clear. He needed cash fast. Martin also found something else. Robert Chun, the attorney who'd drawn up the trust, had a prior business relationship with James. They'd worked together on 2 failed property developments. This was a massive conflict of interest that Robert had never disclosed to me. With this information, we amended our legal petition to include allegations of legal malpractice against Robert and fiduciary breach against both James and Melissa. The hearing was set for January 15, 2025. But before we ever got to court, something wonderful happened. It was early December, about a month after this nightmare began, when my doorbell rang. I was still living in my house. The sale had been frozen by the court order, though Melissa and James had forbidden me from changing anything about the property. At the door stood David, his wife Emily, and my 2 grandsons. Behind them were 2 cars full of luggage. "We're moving in, Mom," David announced. Emily got a job at Oregon State's Marine Science Center in Newport. "We're going to live here while we look for a place, and we're going to help you fight this." I burst into tears, the good kind this time. My son, who I'd been afraid to burden too much, had restructured his entire life to stand with me. But David had done more than just move home. He'd also filed his own legal motion to be added as a co-trustee, citing his status as an equal beneficiary who had the right to participate in trust decisions. And he demanded a full accounting of all trust assets and all decisions made since the trust was created. When Melissa and James received David's filing, along with subpoenas for all their financial records, emails, and communications about the trust, something broke. James, it turned out, wasn't nearly as confident when faced with the prospect of having his shady finances examined under oath. On December 18th, their attorney called Martin to discuss settlement. The negotiation took 3 weeks, but here's what we ended up with. The trust was modified to require unanimous trustee approval for any major decisions, with David added as the 3rd trustee. I retained lifetime exclusive use of both the Portland House and the Montana Lake House, with that provision enforceable and not subject to override. Melissa and James were required to pay $75,000 toward my legal fees, and James was removed as co-trustee entirely, with only Melissa remaining, subject to the unanimous approval requirement with David. But there was one more thing I insisted on: a formal written apology from Melissa, to be read aloud at a family meeting with David, Emily, and me present. That meeting happened on January 10, 2025, in Martin's conference room. Melissa arrived looking like she'd aged 5 years and 2 months. James wasn't allowed to attend. She read the apology, a legal document that also served as an admission of wrongdoing, in a shaking voice. But when she finished, she looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said, going off script. "Really sorry. Not just legally sorry, but actually sorry. James convinced me that we were being smart, that we were securing our future. He said you'd be fine, that you didn't need such a big house anyway. He made it all sound so reasonable. But I knew. Deep down I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway. I've lost everything that matters, my mother's trust, my brother's respect, the respect of everyone in this city. And I deserve it. I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd raised to be better than this, and I made a choice. Melissa, what you did was unforgivable. But I'm going to do something hard. I'm going to forgive you anyway. Not because you deserve it, but because holding on to this anger will hurt me more than it hurts you. You're going to have to live with what you did. That's punishment enough. She sobbed then, really sobbed, and for the first time in months, I saw my daughter again instead of the stranger she'd become. We're not close anymore. I don't know if we ever will be again. She divorced James 8 months later. Once she finally saw clearly who he really was. She goes to therapy now. She sends birthday cards. She's trying. David and his family lived with me for 6 months before buying a beautiful house just 10 minutes away. My grandsons visit me every weekend. And we've started a tradition of spending every summer at the Montana Lake House together. The legal bills ended up costing me $92,000, even with the $75,000 contribution from Melissa and James. But my home, my independence, and my dignity, those are priceless. I'm sharing this story for everyone out there who's facing something similar. Elder financial abuse is shockingly common. It happens to hundreds of thousands of people every year. Families, trusted advisors, caregivers, and yes, even beloved children can manipulate, steal, and exploit. Here's what I learned and what I want you to know. First, always have your own attorney review any financial or legal documents, especially ones involving trusts, powers of attorney, or property transfers. Never use an attorney recommended by the person who will benefit from the arrangement. Second, if something feels wrong, it probably is. Trust your instincts. I knew in my gut that something was off when Melissa's voice sounded strange on the phone, but I ignored it. Third, fight back. Even when it seems hopeless, even when the law appears to be against you, fight. Shine light on what's happening. Bad behavior hates sunshine. And finally, know that you're not alone. There are lawyers who specialize in elder law, adult protective services agencies, and support groups for people going through exactly what you're experiencing. I'm 67 years old now, and I'm still living in my beautiful Victorian home in Portland. I tend my garden, I volunteer at the hospital where I used to work, and I spend time with the family members who stood by me. I've even started dating again. A retired teacher named Frank who makes me laugh and never, ever asks about my financial situation. The roses I planted with George 40 years ago are blooming again. This spring they were more beautiful than ever, and I think maybe that's a metaphor for something. You can be cut down, pruned back to almost nothing, and still bloom again if you have strong roots. So that's my story. The story of how my daughter tried to steal my home and how I fought back and won. It wasn't easy, it wasn't pretty, and the scars haven't completely healed. But I'm here in my home living my life on my terms, and that's victory enough for me. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more real-life stories of resilience, justice, and standing up for yourself. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and whether you've ever experienced something similar. Your stories matter too. And remember, you are stronger than you think, braver than you believe, and you deserve to be treated with respect and dignity no matter how old you are. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise. This is Kathy Richardson signing off. Thank you for listening to my story. And to anyone out there facing their own battle right now, don't give up. Keep fighting. You're worth it.